Good morning, everybody. Thank you for waking up before lunch. It's good to see you all. So my name is Stephanie Hurder. I'm a founding economist at Prysm Group, as was just said. How's the sound level on this? Too loud? Good? Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about blockchain governance. So Prysm Group, we're a blockchain economics and governance advisory firm. So we're led by PhD economists. I have a PhD from Harvard. And we help blockchain and distributed ledger projects figure out their incentive design, their governance design, their token economics, and all that other good stuff. So coming from an economics background, one of the things I think is most amazing about blockchain is rethinking how we make collective decisions, right? This is basically what governance is. And there are a lot of claims made about governance and the ability to decentralize and automate governance that to me are really fantastic. And a great example of this is the DAO. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the DAO. And one of the claims that was made about it, when it was first launched, was the following, that it had autonomous governance. And I've taken this from the documentation of the platform. The ETH held by the DAO will never be centrally managed. DAO token holders are able to vote on important decisions relating to the management of the DAO, including the power to redistribute its ETH among themselves. Right, so there was this very bold claim that we now had a platform, which was going to be used for investing, where there was no longer a need for a central decision maker. And as I said, based on a lot of the economics that I'll talk about, to me this was really impressive. And so we spend a lot of our time thinking about what is governance? What do we mean by governance? And is it possible to have truly decentralized autonomous governance? And so this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to be talking about the way we think about governance and its design, having worked with dozens of projects from startups to corporates. And my talk is going to have two parts. So the first is, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about governance? I think, projects have different definitions and we're sort of converging, but it helps to start out and say, what exactly do we mean by governance? And secondly, I'm going to talk about our conception of the components of governance. And listening to the previous talk, I actually kind of wish that that could have gone in parallel because there are some really great examples that were brought up that illustrate some of the points that we're going to make here. So first, what is governance? And stepping back, governance to us is one part of the overall economic design of any platform. So as you know, a lot of blockchain projects are rethinking how economic systems work. It's one of the most amazing parts of working in blockchain, right? And so when we think about what are the different economic components of a blockchain platform, we use this house framework to organize our thinking. So starting, the house starts from the bottom and builds its way up. Starting at the bottom, you have, the value proposition. What is it that your project is trying to do? This is typically something that hopefully the founding team has figured out before we begin our discussions. Next, there's raising capital. How are you going to fund the development of whatever it is you're building? And then there are three pillars that we think of as forming the incentive layer of the platform. So there's contract design, there's market design, and there's information systems. And all of these are different levers that can be used together to shape the incentives of the different stakeholders who come to use whatever your project is. And a way to illustrate this is the following. Suppose that I'm building a blockchain-based version of eBay. How many in here have used eBay ever? So most of you are familiar with how eBay works. Suppose we're making, a new open bazaar, and we're going to have a blockchain-based eBay. And one of the core tenets of success for this new platform is that people need to come and behave in good faith, right? They're going to buy and sell goods, and you need them to actually go and do what they're supposed to do and not cheat the people on the other side of their transactions. So what are some of the levers that we can use to incentivize good behavior? So first, we can use contract and transaction design. We can make payment contingent on measures of whether you've actually sent what you're supposed to or paid what you're supposed to. And we can have escrow, we can have dispute resolution. These are all tools that help to align the incentives of both sides with the goal of doing what is in the best interests of the platform as a whole. What other tools could we use to incentivize good behavior? I mean, we could use market design. So for example, in any decentralized marketplace, there are going to be tools that help buyers and sellers find each other. We could say, if you cheat someone that you previously transacted with, in any subsequent search, you're going to be penalized in the search list, right? You're going to come up way lower in the list than you normally would have due to your bad behavior. This is an additional incentive, if you care about making any profitable trades in the future, for you to behave in the way you're supposed to. And finally, there are information systems, right? So most of the peer-to-peer platforms that we use on a regular basis have some kind of reputation, where the data enclosed in the reputation comes from the other users, but the design of that reputation was implemented by the platform, right? So if you think about eBay's rating or Airbnb, the structure of the data that's collected and how it's aggregated and displayed was determined by the platform founders, right? And then as the platform works, data is collected and used in the following way. And so we can also incentivize good behavior by saying, if you are terrible to all your Uber drivers, you're going to have a rating of 4 and no one's ever going to pick you up again. Right, so these are all the different tools that can be used in combination to shape incentives on a platform. In our view, a token is a tool that interacts with these different incentive levers to facilitate function on the platform, right? And we think about, today's not talking about token economics, but we're thinking about, do you need your own token? What does its monetary policy need to be so that when it interacts with the incentive layer, you get the outcomes that you want. And so why did I go through all of this? To us, governance is the roof on the top of the house, right? So once you've thought about what are the operational rules of your platform, what are the different incentive levers, what is the token going to do, governance is the set of rules that allows this to evolve over time. And so the more precisely you've thought about what are the incentive levers and the token economics of your platform, the better you can design your governance. Another question we get all the time is, these platforms are new. How are you going to do economic design for something that hasn't existed before? And there's actually many, many Nobel laureates who have tackled problems like this in fields called contract theory, market design. And it's basically the economics version of a scientific process, right? So you start with economic theory and game theory, and you say, what are our hypotheses about how we think this system should work? Can we collect observational evidence that suggests that we're on the right track and doesn't immediately contradict what we think the system design should be? Then can we run experiments? And these can be experiments in a laboratory, these can be experiments in the field, but can we run some kind of test of the system to make sure that the outcomes are going to be in line with what we want? And then finally, can we launch? And this approach has been used in everything from designing school system matching to spectrum auctions to tax systems, right? And so although we're thinking about how do you design new economic mechanisms in an entirely new setting, you don't just need to, close your eyes and squeeze your nose and jump off the cliff. There are ways to test the mechanisms that you're thinking of using to ensure that, or to maximize the probability that you're going to get the outcomes that you want. So all that being said, why am I talking about this for the first 5 minutes? Because it helps frame, what we think about the role of governance is on a platform. So on any blockchain platform, you have 2 different types of rules. You have operational rules and you have governance. So operational rules are the incentive layers I was talking about, the token economics. These are the written down rules that specify how the platform is going to work on a regular basis, right? This is what's in your code, is the operational rules. The governance is the part that fills in the missing pieces in the operational rules. It's the piece that says, something hasn't yet been specified, but we need to make a decision. The rules aren't specified in the code we've already written. How are we going to come to a decision about what to do? And so one very classic example of this is the DAO hack, right? So this is back in 2016. The DAO has launched. A very clever person has stolen $50 million, or about a third of the money from the DAO. And there's a question of, what do we do? How do we handle this, right? Are we going to undo this particular transaction, or are we going to, leave it the way it is? And this was a question that wasn't covered in any of the operational rules, right? And so for those of you who know the story, there was an entire series of ad hoc decisions that had to be made to figure out what was going to happen with the community, right? And the decision wasn't unanimous, there was a hard fork. But this type of activity is exactly why you need governance, right? So that something happens, it wasn't thought of in the original operational rules of the platform. How are we going to think about what to do? And some people think about, they hear this definition of governance and they say, okay, that makes sense. But my platform isn't going to have disasters like the DAO, right? You only need governance when you have an absolute disaster. I'm not planning to have any of those, so I don't really need governance. Governance is also helpful when your platform is unexpectedly successful. So one of my favorite examples of this was the launch of CryptoKitties, which actually has part of its story based in Berlin. So as many of you know, CryptoKitties launches, it completely overwhelms the Ethereum blockchain. There's this huge transaction lag, this huge queue, and to many of the users, it just seems like the blockchain has stopped working. What do we do? So the interventions that solved this crisis had two parts. So first, the nodes decide to raise the network gas limit. This is something that's within their purview. There's contention, but they take a vote and they raise the network gas limit. But you still have this huge backlog of transactions whose gas prices were just too low now, right? They had been submitted with gas prices that were no longer competitive, and absent any kind of action, these transactions were never going to get processed. So a group of core developers and other folks get together. They're actually based in Berlin at the time for some unrelated conference, and they develop a button that allows you to resubmit transactions with a more competitive gas price. So this allows users to resubmit their transactions and starts to clear out the backlog. And so what I think is so interesting about this example is that the first intervention, raising the network gas limit, was something that had been planned for. The second piece was not. Right, and so it just happened to be that a critical mass of decision makers were in the right place at the right time to come up with an appropriate intervention. But hopefully you wouldn't want to rely on that amount of luck in subsequent cases. Does anybody in here still own CryptoKitties? How many CryptoKitty owners do we have? We have a couple. I've got one. So another question we get all the time is, do we really need governance? If we write sufficiently great operational rules, is governance necessary, right? Because maybe 4 years ago, there were a lot of unforeseen disasters that we had never seen in any platform, but as we see more problems, can't we just anticipate them and not really need governance as much anymore? And the answer to this is no, it's not possible to eliminate the need for governance. And the reason is because of an economic concept called contractual incompleteness. And what contractual incompleteness says is that it's impossible to write a contract that anticipates everything in the future that could possibly happen. Right? No matter how much time you spend drafting a contract, no matter how much time and how much detail and thought you put into all of the different cases that are anticipated, there's always something that could happen that you didn't think of when you wrote it. Even if you wanted to spend that much time, it's probably not a good use of your time to sit and spend, weeks trying to think of everything that could possibly happen. And in some cases, when a truly unexpected event happens, the different parties might want to renegotiate, right? So we might get into a situation where, we originally thought that, if something really strange happened, this is what we would want to do. That's what actually happens. And the parties look at each other and say, no, wait, actually, now that this has happened, we all agree we want to do something else. And so there's always going to be a need for governance because there's always going to be something that can happen that your contract didn't take into account or didn't account for when it was written. And so in sum, we think of governance as being necessary and essential for two purposes. The first is updating operational rules, right? So you have operational rules on your platform. Maybe it's how much block producers are paid or the inflation rate of tokens, and you decide as a group that you want to upgrade something, make a change. The second is when your system has failed you. When a situation arises that wasn't accounted for in the original code, and you, as a community, you need to decide what you're going to do next. And before I delve more into the different parts of governance, one thing I want to point out is that it's not possible to avoid economic design, right? So something we hear frequently is, well, I've got it's hard enough to get code written. I don't really want to think about the economics of this, so I'm just going to wait. And the thing is, in a crisis situation, when something's happened and a decision needs to be made about what to do quickly, someone is going to step up to make that decision, right? And so then the question as a platform founder is, do you want that person who steps up to be a person that you've delegated in advance, right? So you've decided in advance that this is someone or a set of people that we trust who are going to decide the next steps in the best interest for the platform? Or do you want whoever can accumulate as much the necessary political power to be able to make that decision? And so it's in your best interest as a platform founder to specify someone in advance who will make these decisions for you rather than just hoping that someone with good intentions shows up at the right time. One thing that gets pointed out to me a lot is that the vigilante here looks way more interesting than the representative, but all right, so that being said, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about the different elements of governance. And this is motivated by an observation that we had over the past year or so, that there's a lot of emphasis when we talk about governance on voting systems. And we'll hear many dialogues that say, it's a long debate about, are we going to use quadratic voting or majority rule, and what's the quota going to be, and are we going to have low turnout weighting or status quo bias or stuff like this. And if you think about a lot of the decision-making processes that we engage with on a regular basis, there's actually way more to them than voting. And if you think about what are the pieces that make these systems function well, the voting is just one tiny piece. So in developing this framework, which we call the wheel, the goal is to enumerate what do we see as the different pieces of governance that need to be considered for a governance system to work well. So these are the 7 elements of governance that we discuss. We shape it as a wheel because typically you have to go through this a couple of times to get a system that works that you like. So you sort of start at the top and you go through and you say, okay, is this sort of an aligned system of decision making? Probably not. You probably have to refine it a little bit. So starting at the top, the first step is figuring out, what are the scope of decisions that this process is going to be used to make? You might have different governance processes for different types of decisions. Who's going to participate in that decision-making process? Who are the stakeholders? Policy research and development. So one of the things I really liked from the previous talk was he was saying that developing proposals takes work and resources. And so he was doing most of the development himself. You have to think about where are these resources going to come from. By what means are upgrades or proposals submitted? How is information about these proposals going to be distributed, both in terms of what they are and the potential impacts? What are the decision-making procedures? That's the voting. And then how is implementation enforced, right? How do you make sure that the decision that you come to is actually implemented by the platform? So I want to talk just briefly about, what are examples of a couple of these and why are they important? So the first is the scope of decisions. Why might you need different decision-making processes for different types of decisions? At a fundamental level, the reason we need governance is because we have a group of people with different opinions about what the group should do, right? If everybody agreed about every action in every circumstance, we don't need a governance process. We just need to pick a person, and we just do whatever that person says, because we know that that person has the same opinions as the entire group, right? So we need a governance process because one of these two things has happened. And you actually have you'll want different types of outcomes depending on which situation you're in. So what is an example of this? Can we go to the next slide? There we go. What if we have different preferences? When I was growing up, my dad and I always used to argue about what kind of ice cream to get. He likes chocolate, I like strawberry. And in situations like this, there's a fairly easy compromise that can be taken when you have people with different preferences. You try to come up with something that's a mix, right? So the solution is we end up going and getting that weird striped ice cream that's, chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla in the middle. And so a compromise is able to satisfy both of us to a reasonable extent when we want different things from the system. So when there are different preferences, frequently you can say, okay, what is something in the middle that will be sufficiently satisfying to both parties? In contrast, when you have different information, this is a type of situation where, for example, we all want the same outcome. We're all on the board of directors of a company and we want to maximize shareholder value because we're in the US and this is what we care about, at least for this example. But we differ in how we think this is best done. Right, so some of the people on the board think that the best path to maximizing shareholder value is investing in research and development. The other side prefers to acquire another company. And the thing about this type of situation is that a compromise isn't really going to work, right? If you say, okay, we're going to take the money and split it in half and have half as big an R&D team and then acquire a company of half the size, that's not really going to have a good outcome. In fact, that's probably going to be worse than picking one or the other, right? So in a situation like this, your decision-making process maybe won't want to come to a compromise decision. You want to pick one or the other. In terms of stakeholders, what I think one of the most interesting developments over the past 6 months to a year is the number of platforms that are developing some kind of representative decision-making process. Right, so councils, groups of block producers, elected bodies of various types that are going to make decisions on behalf of the entire community. And from our point of view, this kind of decision-making process makes a lot of sense. The vast majority of decisions in our daily lives, whether it's in, federal governance or corporate governance, are not made by the entire community. They're delegated to a set of decision makers. And from an economic point of view, this makes a lot of sense. Why is this? Why might we want to delegate decision-making? The first is that, as an economy, we thrive on division of labor, right? There's too many different things in the world to consider to be involved in all of them, right? So we divide up tasks. Some people do some things, some people do others. And there's a whole set of things that honestly, I don't really care about enough to spend time and energy. Time, energy, thinking is our finite resources. And so we might just want to say, it's not worth it for everyone to be involved in everything. The second is specialization. So, for example, suppose that I find out I have a devastating disease and I want to crowdsource potential treatments for my disease. I'm probably not going to just go into downtown Berlin and ask the first 100 people I see what I should do. If I'm going to crowdsource information, I probably want to talk to specialists, aka doctors, who have expertise in the area of my illness. And finally, information distribution systems. And this is actually my favorite area of the wheel. So if you think about a lot of decision-making processes from voting for candidates to selecting policies, we rely on people giving us information about what the implication of the different policies are. As well as if we have a representative government, we rely on aggregated information about the decisions that our representatives are making so that we can figure out whether they're doing what we want them to do. So an example of this was this spreadsheet that exposed the collusion between EOS block producers. So for those of you who aren't familiar, block producers on EOS were colluding with each other, and this was exposed by a spreadsheet that was collected by Wobie, who I believe is one of the block producers. And so it wasn't until this information came out that people realized that the decision makers in the group of block producers weren't quite as independent as people thought. And so rather than relying on one of the users in a leak to expose this kind of information, proactively setting up, for example, voting results, if you're developing a platform and you're going to have a representative council, proactively developing this kind of information system allows users to see what representatives are doing and to trust what's going on. And so I think I have about 1 more minute, so let me just finish. 2 questions that I get a lot. So the first is on-chain governance optimal? And the second is, can governance by itself prevent hard forks? And the first piece is on-chain governance optimal? I think that having some portions of governance on-chain is very helpful. But to us, the most important piece is that you've accounted for the different required pieces of the system. So whether that's on-chain or off-chain, the main goal is that you have a transparent, well-laid out system with all the different component parts. And however that's implemented is fine. And can governance prevent hard forks? A term I also really liked from the previous talk was this concept of rage quitting, right? When do you get hard forks? You get hard forks when a set of users is so upset by the outcome or cares about the outcome enough and has a sufficient mass that they're willing to fork and start their own community. And so we've done some research on this that I won't have time to cover, but basically what we find is that voting processes by themselves are not good at preventing hard forks. If you want to minimize the probability of hard forks, you need to leverage the other pieces of the wheel. So you need to think about the policy proposal process, information distribution. That's going to be far more effective at preventing hard forks than switching from majority rule to quadratic voting. All right, so as I said, I'm Stephanie Hurder. I'm with Prysm Group. If anyone's interested in discussing the industry or governance or any other fun pieces, this is my contact information and also that of Reed Cataldo, who is another founding partner who's here. All right, 30 seconds over.